Thanks so much, Wendy, for that introduction. Thanks to all the folks at the NPG who made this symposium and book possible. And thanks to everyone who's come this afternoon. At some point during the 1840s, the Mohawk Valley Bank of Mohawk, New York, began to inscribe its notes with a portrait of the nation's first president. This was a carefully calculated design choice. Casting George Washington as a revolutionary hero, the portrait worked to affirm the credibility of the bank by aligning it with patriotic feeling and deep historicity, and to bolster the note holder's commitment to the financial transactions facilitated by the document. Standing assuredly before a shadowy background, Washington models an attitude, confidence in a climate of uncertainty, that was necessary to buy goods or speculate on land without hard currency, accept a distant bank's promise to pay as a credible remittance for local assets, transfer and accept debt obligations, extend and use credit, or participate in any of the other risky financial ventures enabled by the notes of the Mohawk Valley Bank. Presenting a founding father as an instructive embodiment of intrepidity, the note portrait offered inspiration and validation to the prospective buyer, borrower, or investor. Even as it urged note holders to conduct their financial business confidently, the modest image cast speculative audacity as a deeply rooted American value. Whether bank patrons knew it or not, the note likeness was part of a deeply rooted body of portrait images that aligned George Washington with the liberal economic ideals and speculative ethos of American capitalism. To begin to shed light on this visual tradition, this paper will look back to its roots, examining two late 18th century paintings of Washington. Hopefully they're coming here. There they are. Okay. Joseph Paravani's George Washington and Edward Savage's The Washington Family, that highlight the president's involvement in risky enterprise. Paravani and Savage's pictures, more specifically, foreground Washington's management of a major speculative venture, the development of the new national capital, or as it was known in the moment, the federal city. The capital scheme was highly controversial in its moment. While Federalists embraced the project, Republicans decried it as a swindle and folly. These arguments were fueled by broader disagreements about speculation and finance, disagreements that intensified as the banking system expanded in the 1790s. Composed in this climate of transformation and conflict, George Washington and the Washington family advanced laudatory accounts of Washington's work as a developer that affirmed the credibility of the capital project and the rectitude of forward-looking speculative enterprise. In so doing, Paravani and Savage's portraits used the president's likeness to outline new modes of economic selfhood and familial belonging that were key to modern market society. George Washington and the Washington family share a common focal point. Paravani's painting depicts Washington gesturing toward an evocation of Andrew Ellicott's 1792 plan of the Capitol. Several members of Savage's group portrait touch or grasp another rendering of the Ellicott plan that unfurls across a table at the heart of the scene. By using these documents as compositional foci, George Washington and the Washington family highlight the major construction venture undertaken by the president during the last decade of his life and draw attention to aspects of that undertaking that alarmed many period observers, its intertwining with boosterism and speculation. After selecting the Capitol's site in January 1791, George Washington devoted his final years to overseeing its planning, financing, marketing, and development. In situating the Capitol plan at Washington's fingertips, George Washington and the Washington family highlight the president's contributions to the development of the city's distinctive street design. They also engage the Capitol project's controversial economic dynamics. Working with little state funding, Washington sought to fund the development of the rustic Capitol site with speculative capital. To this end, the president encouraged associates to invest in Capitol land, administered public sales of city lots aimed at speculators, and endorsed large-scale speculations on city parcels. To build interest in these initiatives, Capitol backers promoted the federal city in newspapers, broadsides, and pamphlets. These texts projected a golden future for the Capitol, assuring investors that it would, quote, grow up with a degree of rapidity hitherto unparalleled, end quote, and become, quote, the most considerable city in America, end quote. Washington also had Pierre Charles L'Enfant's original street plan reproduced in various forms, including standalone engravings and magazine illustrations. This stream of images culminated with Ellicott's 1792 plan, a dazzlingly detailed revision of L'Enfant's design that teems with information and imaginative embellishments. The plan delineates the city's 1,146 squares of purchasable property, records the depths of the Potomac and Anacostia, includes renderings of the unbuilt White House and Capitol, and incorporates textual descriptions of local terrain. Taken together, these bits of data and fancy infuse the Capitol with concreteness and promise, refiguring the tenuous venture as an emerging metropolis blessed with favorable environmental conditions, teeming with investment opportunities, and poised on the cusp of a glorious future. By granting prominent place to the Ellicott Plan, then, Paravani and Savage's portraits drew attention to Washington's management of the promotion and speculative financing of the federal city, aspects of the project that alarmed economic conservatives. Speculation threatened the customary notions of work and profit that these traditionalists held dear. In their view, speculators sought to make money by gambling on the future rather than making useful things for the present, trading in weightless fantasies rather than concrete products, and creating strange forms of value out of thin air. Working from this perspective, opponents critiqued the Capitol project as a folly propelled by dreams and delusion. In 1796, for example, Representative John Swanwick described the Capitol as an, quote, airy fiction of speculation, a mere sort of castle-building dream, end quote. Others attacked the embellishments of Capitol publicity. A 1796 pamphlet thus decried the disingenuousness of promotional city plans of the Capitol, arguing that, quote, the streets laid out in the map we examined, end quote, are in fact, quote, avenues cut through the woods with not a solitary house, end quote. In organizing their compositions around the Ellicott Plan, then, George Washington and the Washington family present the viewer with a multivalent emblem that speaks to the president's role in the controversial speculative and promotional campaigns that arose around the city. In so doing, both portraits use this charge emblem to outline visions of Washington's land dealings that affirm the legitimacy of the Capitol venture and tout the virtue of risky enterprise and speculative projection. George Washington arose out of a specific episode of international diplomacy. In 1796, the Spanish official Josef de Jodenes y Nebo commissioned Josef Paravani, an Italian emigre artist active in Philadelphia, to compose a full-length likeness of the American president. Jodenes intended to give the portrait to Spanish Prime Minister Manuel Godoy to mark that official's successful negotiation of the 1795 Treaty of San Lorenzo. Working to satisfy his patron, Paravani developed a multi-layered interpretation of the American president that spoke to the political dynamics of the treaty and celebrated Washington's efforts at city building. Modeling his likeness rather directly on Gilbert Stuart's contemporaneous Lansdowne portrait, which is upstairs, Paravani situated Washington in a classicized setting replete with attributes. In so doing, the Italian artist introduced several new elements to the scene: the Capitol Plan and a copy of the Treaty of San Lorenzo at left, a pile of armor, a fictive marble sculpture of justice and prudence at right, and a distant view of a lambent harbor. These details work in part to glorify Washington's diplomatic engagements with Spain. Several elements speak to the salutary effects of the 1795 treaty, which established, quote, a firm and inviolable peace and sincere friendship, end quote, between the United States and Spain, shifted the boundary of the U.S. closer to the Gulf Coast, and opened the port of New Orleans to American shipping. While the armor pile invokes the new peace established by the agreement, the harbor view, featuring a ship flying American and Spanish flags, highlights New Orleans' new status as an international commercial hub. George Washington works in various other ways to cast its sitter as a virtuous statesman and ideal ally. The scene thus includes evocations of the president's legislative acumen, legal text at lower right, and patriotic commitment, black cockade at left. The figures of prudence and justice, moreover, reference to the four cardinal virtues, ideals of ethical conduct long central to moral philosophy. Public tributes to Washington frequently invoke the cardinal virtues when trumpeting the president's moral ideality. John Adams' 1797 inaugural address, for example, praised Washington as a, quote, citizen who by a long course of great actions regulated by prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude has secured immortal glory, end quote. Picturing Washington with signs of these and other ideal characteristics, Paravani's portrait cast the president as an experienced, patriotic, and principled leader. In so doing, George Washington implicitly celebrated the treaty that bound its subject to Spain. In entering into an alliance with Washington, the portrait suggests, Spain secured an ideal partner. George Washington also engages and celebrates its sitter's work as a developer. To this end, the portrait draws suggestive connections between the Ellicott Plan and the text of the Treaty of San Lorenzo. Positioned together on a desk, set beneath an inkpot with two quills, and rendered in similar tones, the plan and treaty can be read as the results of a single process of work and thought. Other nearby elements suggest these documents share certain symbolic functions. Positioned above the treaty and connected visually to it by an arcing quill, the harbor view offers a peek at the ideal future that the diplomatic agreement aimed to produce. By pairing these elements, Paravani's portrait subtly invokes the treaty's status as an imaginative attempt to actualize an as-yet unrealized state of being. As a work of creative projection, in other words, not unlike the city plan underneath it. By linking the treaty text and the speculative plan in this way, the painting encourages us to understand the 1795 Spanish-American alliance as something like a wager on the future, an audacious venture that entailed risk and uncertainty. Other elements of the portrait seem in turn to affirm Washington's capacity to carry off these perilous endeavors. While invoking old notions of virtue, the sculpture of prudence also links Washington to a new set of entrepreneurial traits posited by period liberal economic thinkers. Working to theorize forms of market endeavor that were remunerative and socially beneficial, liberal intellectuals turned frequently to the construct of prudence. Jeremy Bentham, for example, identified the, quote, prudent and well-grounded projector, end quote, as an ideal embodiment of audacious enterprise. Adam Smith likewise cast the, quote, prudent man, end quote, as a new paragon of ambitious endeavor, arguing that when this figure, quote, enters into any new projects or enterprises, they are well concerted and well prepared. He can never be hurried into them by any necessity, but has always time and leisure to deliberate soberly and coolly concerning what are likely to be their consequences, end quote. Drawing on prudence's association with practical wisdom, Smith, Bentham, and other thinkers celebrated the prudent man as a rational and deliberate venturer, an economic actor perfectly equipped to navigate the challenges posed by modern markets and carry off ambitious projects or enterprises. Paravani's fictive allegorical sculpture invokes a virtue, then, that was central to liberal imaginings of ideal enterprise. Positioned between this suggestive sculpture and the documents on his desk, Washington would seem to perform the persona of the prudent projector, celebrated by Bentham and Smith, while directing his energies toward the ambitious projects of diplomacy and speculative city building. The president draws literal and metaphorical support from prudence. By aligning the president with liberal constructs of prudence and affirming his fitness to realize the audacious objectives of the Treaty of San Lorenzo and the federal city scheme, George Washington intensified its lionization of the American leader. Casting Washington as a conscientious projector and the capital venture as a rational undertaking, the portrait rejected critiques that figured the city as a folly and affirmed arguments regularly made by supporters of the project. As Paravani began work on his likeness of Washington, Edward Savage was putting the finishing touches on his own rendering of the president. Savage first made preliminary sketches of George and Martha Washington and their grandchildren in 1789 and 91. The artist spent the next several years working up a grand canvas depicting the presidential family and an unnamed slave in a classicized portico overlooking the Potomac Valley. The resulting painting cast the Washingtons as both a larger-than-life gathering of visionaries and an ideal but relatable bourgeois household. Borrowing its structure and setting from John Smybert's Bermuda Group, a landmark early American portrait that depicted George Berkeley and followers as they prepared to launch a utopian settlement on Bermuda, Savage's painting quietly figures the presidential family as a similar body of far-sighted schemers. At the same time, by rendering the Washingtons with domestic trappings and situating them in hierarchized gender roles, the portrait presents the presidential clan as a model bourgeois household, a national family that performs the normative social roles of early Republican domestic life. The enslaved figure imbues the scene with further connotation. Likely intended as a sign of the Washingtons' propertied status, the slave also functions as a foil that reaffirms the whiteness of the family group, and by extension, the national body politic. Various elements of Savage's scene work together then to cast the Washingtons as forward-looking visionaries and a paradigmatic embodiment of white bourgeois kinship. The portrait's engagement with the federal city project extends these symbolic imperatives. Savage's rendering of the president firstly invokes and refigures the projective outlook that Washington adopted as leader of the capital venture. Sitting in an ornate chair, touching a copy of the capital plan and gazing into the distance, the president adopts a pose and attitude central to another mode of seated portraiture, a mode associated with the visualization of rational reflection and calculative forecasting. the scientific portrait. Various scholars have shown that 18th century portraits of scientists use the tropes of the distant gaze and the scientific image or document to evoke their sitters' capacities to accurately observe physical reality, hypothesize credibly about abstract phenomena, and mathematically predict future events. Borrowing the format and iconography of the scientific portrait, Savage's likeness realigns the president's outlook with the rational, predictive vision of the scientist. The painting's rendering of the unnamed slave may in turn work to further affirm the viability of Washington's projections. Detached but poised to serve, the slave can be read as an emblem of readily available labor, and as such, an evocation of the president's access to a productive and pliable workforce capable of realizing his grand visions. While recasting and recuperating the president's projective outlook, the Washington family also explores the broader Washington clan's relationship to the capital scheme. As noted above, Savage's portrait uses the Ellicott plan to organize and unify its familial ensemble. Spread across the table, the plan submits to the pinches, prods, and tugs of 3 out of 4 family members. This structure works on one level to evoke the multi-generational family's commitment, present and future, to the capital project. Certain elements within the group attest in turn to the material character of these commitments. 2 elements within Savage's tableau highlight areas in the city where the president purchased investment properties. The silver pommel of Washington's sword hovers over a spot corresponding to the location of Square 21, where Washington bought 4 lots in 1794. The tip of Martha's fan covers an area that includes Square 634, a wedge-shaped parcel that Washington bought and improved with 2 rental townhouses. I love PowerPoint arrows. I'm a big fan. They're low tech. But all right. By invoking the Washington's sustained commitments to and investments in the federal city project, Savage's portrait affirms the venture's present and long-term viability. In presenting the Washingtons as an ideal domestic group that coheres around real estate speculation, Savage's canvas in turn advances a new vision of land-based kinship, a vision that reworks one of the period's most prevalent modes of group portraiture, the conversation piece, and gives expression to a novel understanding of familial property emerging in the moment. As various scholars have shown, outdoor conversation piece portraits affirm the authority of aristocratic sitters by emphasizing their deep ties to familial land. John Zoffany's 3 daughters and 3 sons of John, 3rd Earl of Bute, for example, pictured their sitters cavorting on the grounds of the family seat in Bedfordshire. Juxtaposed with views of fields and outbuildings, these scenes of outdoor fun bind the children of John Stuart to the landscape of the family's estate. Arthur Devis's Henry Finds Clinton with Wife and Son similarly ties its noble sitters to the landscape of Oatlands, the country seat that Clinton maintained in Surrey. The Washington family advances an account of familial landholding that diverges radically from these aristocratic precedents. If the customary conversation piece imagined rootedness in a heritable estate as the foundation of noble family identity, Savage's picture aligns the Washingtons with a mode of kinship defined by investment in fungible properties and premised on a fundamental alienation from the commodified landscape. In so doing, the Washington family visualized a new construct of familial property holding taking shape across the commercializing republic. Discussing speculation in upstate New York, John Hector St. John Crevecoeur noted in 1801 that, quote, "Wiser farmers content themselves with buying select parcels which they keep up as a precious reserve for their children," end quote. Confronting a market society defined by volatility and class fluidity, middle-class Americans increasingly embrace land speculation as a means by which to buttress their domestic existence, build a, quote, "precious reserve for their children," end quote, and secure their familial futures. By picturing the Washingtons gathered around a real estate map and attending collectively to the details of land dealing, Savage's portrait renders the presidential clan as a kind of figurehead for this new approach to the management of property and posterity. In the process, the Washington family works out a new iteration of conversation piece keyed to the priorities of modern market society. As they worked out their respective likenesses, Joseph Paravani and Edward Savage highlighted the president's controversial efforts to finance, promote, and build the national capital. As we have seen, Paravani and Savage's portraits countered the claims of opponents by celebrating Washington's projective outlook and reaffirming the rationality and viability of the capital venture. Reimagining the president and his kin as ideal embodiments of modern enterprise and landholding, these works set the terms for later portrait representations that would align Washington and other revolutionary leaders with risky commercial, financial, and real estate endeavor, a vast visual corpus that included fine paintings, engraved financial documents, and insurance and banking advertisements like the ones we see here. Little work has been done to trace the development of this visual field or to understand the ways that its speculative figurations relate to more familial cultural representations of the Founding Fathers as military heroes or virtuous Republicans. Like Paravani and Savage's portraits before them, these images raise intriguing questions about the mechanisms of economic and political belief within American liberal democratic society. In what ways have cultural imaginings of the revolutionary past and its venturesome heroes worked to underwrite the risk-taking ethos of modern American capitalism? To what extent is American nationalist discourse and patriotic commitment dependent on speculative forms of future-minded projection? By examining the economically coded images of Washington and other revolutionary leaders that appeared in 19th and 20th century exhibitions, banks, and real estate offices, historians might begin to address these issues and understand the ways that portrait representations have worked to interweave economic and political modes of conviction. Thank you.